Good evening, thanks for your company. Christchurch homeowners are pressuring the government to develop a national strategy on sea level rise. But is this global warming storm in a teacup or something far more serious? Lynched starts right now. Good evening, great to have your company tonight. Well, nearly 18,000 homes could be affected by this new coastal hazard zoning being proposed by the Christchurch City Council. We'll get to that shortly, but first, progress in the central city. Yes, it's looking great. And now you know I'm impatient and I want to see development like everybody else does in the city. And while the government continues to muck around when it comes to the convention centre, yes it does, and the sports metro facility, who knows when that'll actually start. But let's be honest, private investment in this city needs to be acknowledged. So take a look at this. Now that video has been seen by nearly 100,000 people online. Now many of you who either listen to my radio show on News Talk ZB or watch this show will know I'm highly critical of local and government agencies for being so slow when it comes to the rebuild of the city. Now I filmed and edited that video on my own time because I've noticed a great change in this city with what's happening, at least in the central city, and for the better. Now, yes, I'm going to be honest, some of those buildings look like a bit boxy, don't they? But there is genuine progress happening in Christchurch, and I wanted to acknowledge the private investors who have decided to stay in this city when they could have left town, and like several did. Now, yes, I understand the issues facing the east of Christchurch, which is why I got together with Dion Swiggs from that charity organisation, Rebuild Christchurch, and the amazing film director, Jared Smythe, and produced a short video interviewing residents from elderly people to young people about their feelings on the city's future, particularly out in the east. Now that video was viewed over 100,000 times as well. Now nobody's not denying there's still a lot of work to do. I get that, but for the first time a few weeks ago, I felt proud and hopeful seeing so much activity, which will be great for everybody at the end of the day. It really will be. It is understandable to look down at progress when there are so many people doing it tough. Last week, news came out that class action is being taken against Southern Response. Many are still frustrated, and rightfully so. But it's equally important to acknowledge meaningful progress in this city, and it's my job to provide that balance. Posting a positive video does not negate the issues people are still facing in this city. It shouldn't be a one or the other. It should be this and this. And that's this week's memo to Christchurch. Well, still to come on this show, a group called Christchurch Coastal Residents United's written a letter to the Prime Minister with concerns about this new coastal hazards zones. It sounds a bit boring, doesn't it? But it could affect nearly 18,000 residents. And this is a proposal being led by the Christchurch City Council. Now, the man leading this group is Mark Munro, and he will join me next on the program. Welcome back to Lynched on CTV. Great to have your company tonight too. Well, a group called the Christchurch Coastal Residents United's written a letter to the Prime Minister with concerns about this new coastal hazards zoning that's being proposed by the Christchurch City Council. It follows a report engineering company Tonkin and Taylor prepared for the council, which focuses on how sea levels could rise over the next 50 to 100 years. Now, in that letter to the Prime Minister, the group says the council is taking an ultra precautionary approach without due consideration for coastal communities. The group has also called for an extraordinary meeting with full council, requesting that it backs the letter. To discuss this is Mark Munro, who leads that group. And good evening to you.
Good evening, Chris.
Are you surprised that 18,000 properties could be affected by this report?
Well, it was a bit of a shock. I mean, when I first heard about it, and like most people, we've only heard about it in the last few weeks. And, when you talk about a coastal issue, you tend to think, just a few people along the coast.
Yeah.
It was a real eye-opener to actually get onto the maps, and I drove all around the whole area of the extent of the inundation zones. And I took a photo at the furthest extent from the coast, and I took a photo of Jade Stadium, and I showed it to the Mayor and a few councillors, asked them what the significance of that picture was, and they weren't aware of it, but of course that was where I took the picture from, was the extent of the zone. So it's not really a coastal issue.
No, it's not coastal.
All.
As you rightly point out, it affects many places inland from the coast. You say this report's it's a bit, it's too conservative. What's the problem with it exactly, though?
Well, I think,
because don't we need to prepare for the future?
Oh, exactly. And in fact, a lot of people who've raised a lot of concern about it have made that point, that if there's a genuine risk, we need to know. But because it's such a serious issue, we're talking 18,000 properties, and that's roughly 40,000 people, possibly more, and $9 billion worth of property. And we're talking about something that may or may not happen in 50 to 100 years. We're sort of saying, well, why is there such a big hurry to come up with a report which we think is flawed? But also the big issue for us is the report's put through in the Earthquake Enabling Act. So under a normal process, a planning process, we could make submissions. The council would probably talk to us about them. There'd be a hearing, there'd be a decision, and out of that, if you didn't like the decision, you have the right, you could go, if you want to, you go to High Court, you could go to the Environment Court, but because it's in the earthquake legislation, we've got a very, very short period of time, and at the end of it, if we can't convince the hearing panel, we have absolutely no right of appeal. And
it's an interesting position we're all in, because on one hand you've got this report that says what might happen in the next 50 to 100 years. By all accounts, they contradict what they're saying because they're not quite sure either. Perhaps it's the worst case scenario, who knows? But during that time we could all experience another earthquake, for goodness sake. So is this a report for the sake of reporting for reports, if you get what I'm saying?
Well, if we go back a step, the council haven't initiated this off their own bat. I mean,
it's a legal document required by government. I understand that.
So they're following it, but I think there's a little bit element of let's shove it all through in the Earthquake Act and get everything all sorted at the same time. And everyone keeps saying to me, why the hurry? Let's do it once and get it right, because I think the council don't realise that they're buying probably the biggest fight they've ever been involved in.
I want to ask you this question, and it sounds boring on the face of it when we talk about coastal hazards reports, but I think it is important, and that's why you're here tonight. So for those who are not aware of what the Coastal Hazard Report presents for issues for those nearly 18,000 properties, what's the major concern, Mark?
Well, of course, reports come out. It's based on a potential 1 metre sea level rise, and so they've come up with zones on properties, essentially erosion zones 1 and 2, and inundation 1 and 2. So the basis of all that, if your property is in that zone, you have existing use rights. But the bottom line is that the zones become discretionary. So the best case scenario is your property has discretionary use rights. And what that actually means is if you decide you want to go and extend your kitchen, do any building other than what you've got, the first step you have to do is go and get a report by a coastal engineer. You essentially have to prove that you can mitigate against the twin risks of erosion and inundation.
How can anybody mitigate those effects when we still don't know what those effects could be down the track?
Right. You're trying to mitigate against something unproven. And I mean, aside from that, the cost of doing it, if you've got a cheap house somewhere and you want to extend it, $50,000 extension, you could spend $100,000 plus very, very quickly. I mean, you imagine there aren't.
So this would be almost like an additional consent.
Yeah. You imagine 18,000 property owners wanting to do a few minor repairs, all having to go to a coastal engineer. Well, we're already finding out there aren't that many coastal engineers.
But wait a minute though, and let me play devil's advocate with you one moment. If this is the point you make, that this could happen with having to get your own coastal engineers, hasn't this report already done the groundwork though? They've done the groundwork.
Well,
here are the issues.
They're saying what the risks are,
right?
And then the property owner has to mitigate against them. So this Tonkin and Taylor report says you're going to have flooding on your property either in the up to 50-year period, up to 100-year period. So you've got to go and say, well, okay, this is how I've got to deal with it. And it might be on the discretionary properties. It might be simply that you have to raise, particularly towards Jade Stadium, you might have to raise the floor level. But if you're closer to the coast and you're in the erosion or inundation zones 1, which is 0 to 50, building is non-complying, and that becomes, you still have a right to make an application for consent, but as my solicitor pointed out and a planner pointed out to me yesterday, they use words like this would be very problematic or very, very difficult. And when a lawyer says it will be problematic, what it means is it's going to cost you a huge amount of money. So what's
the ideal outcome then? You want this report to be scrapped? You don't want the council to take this into consideration? You don't want the rezoning of particular areas to be classed as potential facing either flooding or coastal erosion? What is it you actually want?
What we're asking, and we've gone to the government, is basically, in a nutshell, to throw this whole process out and start again, because we know it has to be done, but we want it started again in a contestable process. The TNT report, the Tonkin and Taylor report, had less money spent on it than those 4 signs I might have mentioned to you earlier in the week, the green signs in the CBD. And you're talking billions of dollars worth of property that already are being affected. We were told at our meeting on Thursday that there were 3 people at a meeting of 300 that already have been turned down for insurance because of the hazards on the limbs.
Well, that's what I want to get to you after the break. The whole issue with insurance here. We've gone up to year 5 of the September earthquakes and trying to fight our insurance companies, and we've still got that to contend with. But I want to get to some of the science later. But just say the science is correct. Now, one report here, it says the report looks at the likely impact of a 40 centimetre sea level rise over the next 50 years and a 1 metre rise over the next 100 years on the Canterbury coastline. If that is the fundamental, if that is genuinely the case, then what do you expect the council to do?
Well, we would expect them to do some mitigation. And I know they've talked about it since this has become an issue, but that's really pointless. If you're going to penalise people now for something that you can mitigate against, and you believe in the science of this report, they know exactly what they need to do right now to mitigate.
Well, that's a good point then. If they believe this report to be the case, then why aren't the council?
Yeah.
But then again, others would argue, though, if you choose to live next to a coastal area or in a so-called flooding zone, it's your own problem. What do you say to that?
Well, as I say, the flooding zone's right into Jade Stadium, and the silly thing is, if you look at the report, they're using 1 metre, but they recommend in the report that any development in 1.5, they use 1.5 to 2 metres for developments. The CBD's only 1 metre higher than the flood zone.
If you're lucky. We've got to take a break. When we return, I do want to discuss the insurance issues with you, because this does affect many people with insurance, and also the science, which some are suggesting is not all that factual. Stay with us. Welcome back to Lynched on CTV. So apparently nearly 18,000 properties could be affected by the council's decision to look at rezoning some areas around Christchurch as hazardous. Mark Munro is my guest tonight. Mark, let's just look at the so-called science here. If we're to believe the experts, they say, look, at the end of the day, the sea level will rise, this is what's going to happen, but you dispute the science. Is that because, to be fair, it doesn't fit your narrative?
Well, just to start off, I'm not a scientist, but certainly I'm getting plenty of opinions. Our argument with the science is we actually want it tested. We can't challenge it because the 1 metre sea level rise was already put in stage 1, which we weren't advised of, so we can't challenge that. But there's certainly been a lot of opinion on that. The 1 metre sea level rise is based on IPCC 8.5, which the media tend to trot that out as business as usual, but it's actually their worst case scenario. And
some would argue it's better to go for the worst case scenario than the lightest possible scenario, though.
Yeah, if you sort of plan around, if the council plan around mitigating the risk to that level, but if you go and penalise 40,000 of your residents with something that's absolutely worst case scenario, do you know how to get to that scenario? There's a whole lot of things that must happen, and even then they're not sure whether it will, but more than doubling of the world population, and according to the UN, that's about 30-40% above their predictions. It means that a 10-fold increase in the use of coal, and you've probably seen people wandering around streets protesting at burning coal as it is. Solid Energy are in the process of going broke because they can't sell it. And to use 10 times the amount of coal annually means over that period that we've used double the total world reserve of coal.
This is also, let's be honest about it, you're a property developer out there in New Brighton, you've got a lot of invested interest in this. The concern would be that your property values might go down, but really, would it really happen? If there's a report that suggests that you're living in a coastal hazard area, would property values really suffer?
Well, it's basically happening now because, as I've mentioned, insurance now is hard to get. People are getting turned down, and the next step for that is if you can't get insurance, you can't get a mortgage. And of course, if you can't get a mortgage, if people are having to sell up, the prices will go down. And when you have a risk on your property, or when you've only got existing use rights, it takes away all your options of, you might want to split your section up and put a couple of units on it. You can't do that without a major battle with council.
You've spoken with council staff, you've spoken with the mayor, right?
Yes.
What do they tell you?
Well, at the moment, I think...
Please don't say they look surprised, because we pay them to not look surprised, actually.
Well, there's mixed messages coming out, frankly, because I think everybody is just simply signed this policy off. It's been put in front of council by the environment staff. They've signed it off, and they're only just clicking to all the implications.
Is that disappointing for you, Mark?
Well, incredibly so.
I would have thought that our paid elected representatives, and I'm going to have a go, should actually be well aware of this report, as opposed to saying, oh...
Well, I actually made a comment in a letter that was to go to the council, but it got taken out because it was probably a little bit impolite. But I made the point that I believe that the councillors didn't know what they were signing off. But I hope they didn't know what they were signing off, because if they knew what they were signing off and what the effect they were having on 40,000 people, they shouldn't actually be in the job.
Well, good point. I want to ask you about the Kapiti group, because for those at home thinking, there's nothing we can do, it'll be signed off, they'll get their way. Not so. A group in the North Island challenged their council and said, you're not doing this to us, and they won. That decision was reversed. Tell the audience about that, because that's important.
Well, unfortunately for the Kapiti District Council, they picked on an area that's mostly retired people and has a high incidence of barristers, retired High Court judges.
Excellent.
Environment Court judges.
And all the time in the world to fight it.
And incredibly capable people. So they fought it, but they're offering us their assistance because they're so incensed by the whole thing. In fact, anybody that becomes aware of it, in fact, we had Sir Tipene Regan come out making pretty strong statements in support of us today.
If the Kapiti residents were successful, doesn't that give you good heart? They've obviously set a precedent now that their council failed to ram this through. Yep. Surely this council will too.
Well, it does. Unfortunately, as I said, we're in a different process. They had the right of appeal. We don't. You all know about some of the worst murder cases in the country. All of those people, if they're convicted, they go back to court many times with the right of appeal paid for by the taxpayer. We're treated worse than murderers. We don't have a right of appeal.
I've read this report. and it's about 45 pages. It's interesting reading if you can't sleep at night. But I want to pick you up on something that I thought was interesting, because I don't get how officials can take this report seriously when it says these words, and I quote, coastal processes and future shoreline positions are difficult to accurately forecast over a 100-year time frame due to the potential of different feedbacks to slow or increase the rate of historical trends. These forecasts become more uncertain when considering the effects or potential sea level rise and interrelationships with other systems, i.e. spit and estuary inlets. That is the most... That's a paradox. Well, it's saying we're going to give you the worst case scenarios, but at the end of the day we don't know, but you might as well do this anyway.
Well, you're right.
That frustrated me, that sentence.
That's a very long way of saying what you don't know, but another good example is, particularly along the coast, they talk about all of the sand dunes eroding, and if you talk to locals who've lived there all their lives, and that's what Sir Tiffany said yesterday, they've been accreting, which is, they've been expanding.
Yeah.
And they talk about the mechanism that makes the sand out there. It all comes from sediment from the Waimak. So what they're saying is there's not going to be enough sediment from the Waimak at some stage in the foreseeable future. But then in the report it states we don't know what effect climate change will have on this sedimentary process. Well, you can't have one without the other.
No.
And
now you point to this this image here, and I'll put this up to the camera as well. Take us through this, because you want to mention this, don't you?
Well, I mean, we talk about the science being settled, and that what the report put in front of us is fait accompli. This is what we actually believe. Well, here, these dotted lines, this is the erosion map, erosion 1, so it's 0 to 100 years, so you can see it goes in a nice thin straight line there, but then all of a sudden it does a dog leg here, a perfect laser cut straight line, and more than doubles. We've all played with sand, buckets of sand in a sand pit, and erosion doesn't happen on a perfect 90-degree straight line. I mean, that alone would be highly embarrassing, or should be, for the council. So
what next, Mark? Only just 7 or so days left to get submissions into the council.
Well,
you're wanting for an extension,
we've only got till Friday, and I understand there's a likely extension coming, but that's not the total that we want. We want the whole thing thrown out and started again.
How confident are you that will be the case? How confident it will get thrown out?
Well, I mean, you can't be totally confident, but you'd have to say that if the council don't listen and the government don't listen, they're buying a massive fight.
You also, they're asking the Prime Minister to obviously throw this out and make this a national strategy. But how can you possibly do that when different coastal areas affect different areas and sea levels affect different places, though? It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, though, is it?
No, what they need is a basic, for a start, a sea level rise that can be accepted, because the situation we have now is, the Ministry for the Environment gives some guidance, and the council have taken that here and added a little bit, rounded it up quite a bit, frankly. But they're supposed to take local situation into account, and they haven't done that. But you've got the situation where we might accept 1 metre. When Auckland do it, they might accept 2. Or what happens? Does the sea start running down from Auckland down to here?
Well, let's hope not, Mark. Out of time. Nice to see you. Thanks for your time tonight. Thank you for informing the viewers. If you want more information on this, you can always head to the council website. Just take a see. We're almost done. And that is our show for tonight. Don't forget to join me on CTV. No, this is CTV on News Talk ZB tomorrow. I'll be asking Christchurch Mayor Leanne Dalzell these very questions. Until then, from everyone here on the Lynched program, have a good night.